Gang, we're back. I'm Dr. Goodwin, clinical associate professor, University of Washington, working at the Billings Clinic here. And I have my esteemed colleague with me.
Thank you, sir. Nicholas Eifredi, hypnotherapist and future LMHC.
All right. Our discussion today is about Lord of the Rings. We've been itching to get into this stuff, so let's do it. It's rather than like go step by step through the Lord of the Rings like we did with Beowulf. I think it's going to be, that would take not only forever, but I'm not really sure it would be as interesting as doing it a different way, which is taking different concepts and aspects and kind of doing a deep dive on it, because the Lord of the Rings is so influential on the fantasy genre. And here in my channel, we talk about fantasy all the time and what is it and the psychology. I thought it'd be really good to take a look at certain aspects. So today we're going to talk about evil. And the main question that we're going to explore is, who is the real villain in the Lord of the Rings? And the answer, you might be surprised at what I think the answer is anyway. You might disagree, but there it is. So I'll start off with fantasy in general. As we've mentioned in other videos, I think fantasy is about the encounter of the ego with the other. Fantasy, horror, and sci-fi all deal with this, but fantasy deals with it, I think, the most basic or fundamental or universal level. It's the encounter with the mysterious. And the mysterious could be terrifying. In horror it is. And the mysterious could be the future, which can also be terrifying. So many times horror and science fiction go hand in hand. Because of that, that's what all this post-apocalyptic stuff is about. But it can be also hopeful, so it's not necessary for sci-fi for it to involve horror necessarily. But it is about where are we going as a species. Fantasy is about what does it mean to be human at all, and how do I encounter the divine and the mysterious. Sometimes it can take quite a bit to see this in fantasy, but it's embedded and I think baked into the whole genre, because of the tools that they use to tell stories in a fantastical manner. You can't help but bring that theme in. So that's at its best. That's when fantasy is at its best, when it acknowledges this, at least on some level. I think sometimes storytellers are just very intuitive and they don't necessarily intend for this to be a theme, but in their really, it just sort of winds up being it's part of it because it's, they're doing it really well. At its worst, fantasy is about empty ego projections, power complexes, and just basically the ego trying to work out its own individual issues by creating fantastical scenarios to kind of alleviate its suffering. Okay, that's at its worst. When you have stories that don't really amount to anything except for the ego wishing for something. So that would be a story where you've got somebody who's kind of downtrodden and they magically achieve immense power and they're hailed as a great hero, and that's the end of it. There's nothing else to it. Right? There's plenty of that stuff out there, and it doesn't have anything really to do with the ego encountering the divine or the unknown or the mysterious. It's all perfectly well known. It's, I want more power, and so I wish it into existence, and now I have all this power, and isn't that great? Lame. Okay, so, but we're not going to talk too much about crappy fantasy here, because we're talking about Lord of the Rings, baby, the great granddaddy of fantasy. And I was going to get into the subject of evil, but before I did kind of dive into that, I wanted your reflections on what do you think. Evil is often presented in fantasy in a certain way, like the Dark Lord and all that kind of stuff. What is up with that? Why did they do that, do you think?
I think it's the kind of, it's such a common theme in most fantasy narratives.
It's always good versus evil.
Yeah, it's always very
good versus evil. It's very stark contrasts.
There's a very much a polarity there.
Yeah, exactly. So why do you think that is? Why do fantasy narratives in particular?
I think I think it originated. I think Tolkien honestly kind of was, when you said the great grandfather, the great granddaddy of all this. I mean, he really was the first one to kind of like bring this through, even though I think, and you mentioned this before we started recording, there was a lot more complexity there and kind of moral, ethical, metaphysical complexity there. But I think more, I mean, I don't want to say more modern, and I don't want to generalize modern fantasy work, but there is this tendency to kind of just say, all right, this is the cookie cutter polarity. It's easy to a certain extent. You have this one big bad that we just need to kind of get rid of. And it's going to take all of us to kind of come together and do this for the sake of the good, for the greater good. And that's it. And yeah, I think to a certain extent it is easy to just say this is the kind of evil, corrupting force of the world, and it represents everything that is against our will in our life to a certain extent.
Right. So from a depth psychology point of view, it is often easy to fall victim to the idea of the ego versus the shadow.
Yep.
Whereas and that becomes a problem if we don't value the shadow at all. If we don't look at, because the shadow is basically those aspects of ourselves that we don't like, that we think are bad, that we need to push away. Right. But, you can't do that necessarily. And oftentimes what you feel is something that is wrong or bad about you winds up being a strength. Okay. So that complexity gets lost in a lot of depictions of evil in fantastic narratives, where the evil is absolute bad and just needs to go. Not that doesn't exist. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that a lot of the subtlety gets lost there. And Lord of the Rings and fantasy in general oftentimes gets accused of moral simplicity, oversimplifying things, and everything's black and white and it's just too easy and all that stuff. And in many cases that is true, but not in Lord of the Rings. And we'll get to why I think that is as we go. But when if you're gonna introduce something like pure evil in a story, then you are essentially making a statement about what you think it is and what we're supposed to do about this evil. In a simplistic narrative, it's get rid of it, make it go away, fight it, and that's that. And the way that the heroes overcome the evil, if they do, which they typically do unless it's horror, then how they overcome it is the statement of proscription that the storyteller is giving you, saying this is the way that you defeat evil. This is what evil looks like. This is what evil's about, and this is how you beat it. Okay, so the problem with this, so as we've talked about before, genres import their own storytelling forms and motifs, but they also all come with a set of issues that have to be solved by the storyteller. And for example, we talked about magic systems in other videos about how if you introduce the idea of magic, then you have to counterbalance that with an intense scrutiny over consistency, or else the belief in the magic system is going to fall apart. Now, fantasy fans such as myself tend to be pretty darn forgiving about this sort of thing. But, we can only take so much, right? And the more consistency you can get in the non-magical aspects of your story, the more believable the magic part of it will be. This is one of our problems that we had with the Doctor Strange story. It just seemed like anything goes, and so you lose a lot of tension from that.
Right.
So one of the issues when you're talking about evil in fantasy is this, since you've got fantasy, then you can show us what pure evil looks like. In a non-fantasy story, like a character-driven drama, you can't do that, right? No, people are going to be like, "What is this guy doing?" Pure evil in ordinary people, right? A movie like that just doesn't work. But this is fantasy, so you can do that, and that's also the weakness. The weakness being that I can oversimplify it. I can say, "Here's the bad guy, and all we got to do is defeat him, and yay, everyone wins." la-di-da, I can go home happy. And so then that comes across as trite and shallow. And the Lord of the Rings is anything but those things. Even though it's been accused of those things, it is not. And we'll see why. A recent example is Grindelwald. He's a bad guy. He does bad stuff. He hates muggles. Let's beat him. Yay, we win. And then that's that, right? So what is it? What is Rowling saying with the story? That hating people and being bigoted is bad. Okay.
Right.
I mean, who doesn't agree with that? Is it worth saying?
Show us why, right?
Show us why. And also, I mean, they beat him, and then what?
Mm-hmm.
And now I guess I should be fair in that we still got 2 more movies supposedly, although I don't think it's doing too well. I don't know. Hard to say, but presumably there's 2 more stories to go that may change these issues, and that's certainly possible. One of the things, I've been watching the Obi-Wan show lately, and I've heard lots of people complaining about this or that, and I'm like, let's watch the whole thing first and give it a chance. So I want to do the same thing there, but at least as we're given it right now, Grindelwald doesn't hold up as a great depiction of evil. It's just too simple, and the solution is to outmagic him. How applicable is that to real life? Even if you take it as a symbol, right? Okay, outsmart bad guys. Okay, check.
Right.
That's it. That's all there is to it.
I, as an audience member, I think, and I'm sure we'll get into this more, but it's really, it makes it so much more of a compelling story when you're shown the turn, you're shown why, you're shown the kind of event in which this character kind of goes from you step over that kind of boundary and you say, okay, now I get it. But also in that event, there is some level of kind of understanding. I think Marvel did this really well with Thanos to a certain extent.
Yeah, that's what I was going to talk about next.
Yeah.
But right. I'm glad you bring him up, because Thanos. So Thanos is evil. Is the depiction of evil in that series of movies. He embodies the idea that evil can arise out of good intentions. Right. That's an interesting statement about evil.
Yep.
Rather than just give us evil, it's just there, and you can do that, and you can do it effectively. But you've got to add more complexity to the other piece of the story, which is, what do we do about it? That's what Tolkien does with evil. Tolkien says, here's evil. And although we do hear in the Silmarillion a little bit about why Sauron becomes evil, for the most part, it's kind of flimsy. I mean, it's just there. It's just evil. Deal with it. But where the nuance and the complexity comes in is everything that goes from that. In Marvel, in the MCU, with the Thanos storyline, they started off with Thanos, but gave us the rationale for why he turned. That's interesting, but they didn't stop there, because in a fantasy story, you don't want to just have, oh, here's a bad guy and we just beat him and that's that. We want to know, okay, what is evil? What does it look like? What is the movie maker saying about the nature of evil? And we'll see that through the way it's depicted. And then, how do the good guys overcome evil if they do? Because then that is also giving us what the storyteller thinks is the solution to evil. So these are very important questions. They're timeless questions.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, we saw this in Beowulf, right? The dragon was just plain evil, but it arose from separation and loneliness and isolation. And we came to see that the dragon represented disconnection from the universe and others and everyone else, and the despair, really. And then it gives us a prescription how to deal with that despair. You go through thought, you go through word, you go through deed, you summon and muster all the strength and all your tools, and you face it, even though you know you are going to lose. And Tolkien imported a lot of that into the Lord of the Rings. And he did it very well. So let's getting back to Thanos, right? So for Thanos, it's that evil is depicted as something that can arise from good intentions, particularly if you believe the end justifies the means.
Yep.
He's understandable, he's reprehensible, but he's understandable. It's like, I can see the logic there. If you're put into a corner that badly, you might go down that road.
Mm-hmm.
That's interesting. But then the second piece of that is, well, okay, so what do we do with this guy? He's really powerful. What do we do? What are we gonna do with him? Stop his crazy plan. And in that case, the Endgame movie, the two Endgame movies give us the solution, which is you have to face your inner demons. You have to learn how to work together as a team.
Yep.
To defeat that. Not bad. Fairly simple and straightforward. Like, okay, teamwork, yay, right? Like all of your anime cartoons are all like, like that, right?
Right. Yeah.
At least a good half of them are like that. The importance of teamwork. Well, we are a cooperative species, right? So it's easy to see why that would be in there all the time. Right. Work together.
It's interesting because he's really kind of a eco-terrorist to a certain degree, right? He's kind of saying, all right, we need to decrease the universe's population in order for us to all survive.
Yeah.
And I mean, I remember after that movie, there was like hashtag Thanos was right. And it's just like, no, he wasn't right, but it really does give credence to like kind of this complex around an over-identification of an idea, like the ends justify the means, this kind of utilitarian belief. And while you were talking, it was interesting because I was thinking about, well, in Endgame, I mean, they had to literally go back in time in order to not even defeat him in the present, but bring everyone back, to bring life back.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was kind of a great, it's a great metaphor for kind of almost depth psychology work, right?
Absolutely.
Going back and seeing where these nodal points are and these complexes are. And in the end,
that's a great metaphor for therapy.
Yeah.
Because that's what you're doing with your therapist is time traveling.
Yeah.
You're going back in time and you're recreating the past to make sense of it.
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly what they do. But again, because it's fantasy, they can show it to you. Mm-hmm. They can say it's not just a mental exercise. You're literally going back in time and facing your father, right? Like Tony does, and engaging with that complex and and the power dynamics and all that stuff that went along. And they did a good job with that. I like that.
Yeah.
All right. So that's pretty good. Fantastical depiction. Not bad.
Yeah.
Star Wars. All right. So Star Wars, we got the Emperor. We're not going to talk about the sequel trilogy. No. Forget about that. But let's talk about the original trilogy. Okay. Just for a second here. And there we've got evil is personified as the Emperor. We have no idea how he came into power. And so he's an absolute evil. He's an absolute evil in the prequel trilogy too. But we'll get to that. In the original trilogy, he exemplifies evil through his actions, right? And the Star Wars trilogy tells us and argues that what evil is about is oppression, tyranny, sadistic cruelty. Okay, kind of hard to argue with that. Causing fear on purpose. But like I said, there's no comment about how he came to be. So it's not an argument of where evil comes from. That doesn't necessarily have to be a part of the equation. It's more about what is evil and what do we do about it. And in that case, the solution was very different from what we saw in the Marvel universe. It was believe in the Force, believe in the power of good, let go of hate and aggression. Luke literally throws his lightsaber away and lets go. And that will destroy the Emperor. Love will destroy evil. That's a really powerful, very powerful message. And it's I think why it resonated with people, even though, at least in my opinion, the Return of the Jedi isn't quite up to the quality of the other two. But it's a great story, and it's particularly saved by the Luke through line. Yeah, because the other characters is kind of like, well, let's go fight another Death Star.
Right.
Give me a break with the flying giant laser balls. Enough with the laser balls.
You don't like the little Ewoks?
No, Ewoks, they don't bother me. They're fine. I'm tired of the giant laser balls. Like,
I know.
Blow it up.
Yep.
Anyway, so but it doesn't matter because that scene there with Luke and Vader and the Emperor is great, and also the connection with family there too as well. That even though Vader is corrupted and all that stuff, He's not so corrupted that he's not going to care about his son.
Mm.
So that's faith in that is what the original trilogy is arguing is the way you deal with evil.
Yeah.
Pretty good, pretty powerful. The prequel trilogy now, evil is the depiction of evil and how it comes to be and all that kind of thing is much more nuanced and complex in the prequel trilogy. Say whatever you want about Lucas's writing, he's got a 10 ear for dialogue, sure, but his storytelling is really good.
Yeah.
I think. Again, he's an absolute evil. And but then we're shown how evil rises into dominance, how it spreads, and how sneaky evil can be in this sense, right? Very, very resonant, powerful idea. And then you can see this in the actions of Anakin Skywalker. Not only does it say the Empire rises to power on a grand galactic scale, but we also see it on the intimate scale with Anakin. He's got good intentions. Okay, so did the Republic. Evil sneaks in there and it does its machinations behind the scenes in both the Jedi Order and Anakin, and exploiting that vicious mole of his nature, and also of the Jedi Temple as well. There's this little weakness that Palpatine exploits in both at the same time. It's brilliant. But brilliant also because you can look at it and go, yeah, I can see that actually happening. So he really manages to accomplish the fantasy, getting past the fantasy, potential weakness of believability. Okay, so not only do we see the Republic become the Empire, we see Anakin become Vader.
Yep,
it's a great parallel there on the grand, as above, so below, right? So in the large scale and even individual scale. Now, the lesson then and the argument, I should say, that is given to us by the actions of the plot are that a tragedy happens when you are over-involved in dogmatism and you're over-involved in political machinations and you lose sight of the deeper mystery, which is the Force. Evil can slip into the cracks when you do that, right? So it's overly rigid and ego-centered.
Yeah.
Right? It's not looking outward at the wider picture. So, right? So Qui-Gon was the embodiment of that, and he died.
Yeah, right. It's the Jedi Order was blinded by their kind of one-sidedness, right? And when they looked at Anakin as this kind of balancing of the Force, the one, right? Just like, well, you're all the way over here, right? And there's nothing going. It was in an antiodromia, right? It was going to inevitably swing in the opposite direction,
right? And bringing balance to the Force doesn't tell us which side of the Force needed balancing.
Right.
In that case, it was the light side that had petrified and needed to be shaken up.
Yep.
Okay, but we can do that. We can do right. So I don't want to get too deep into that. But I mean, you can see how much is there. There's so much there. And people are still talking about it. So that's the great sign that you've got a substantial statement that you're making, right? So George Lucas, being the storyteller that he is, was able to do that. So now what about Lord of the Rings? I think that Lord of the Rings actually has one of the most precise and nuanced depictions of evil in all fantasy. And it's easy to miss it because it's easy to get distracted by Sauron, honestly, because Sauron is just ultimate evil. He's very absolute. Now, that's not necessarily bad, particularly if you build it up to where it's like really, really dangerous and very difficult to do anything about, which is exactly what Tolkien does. Sauron is basically invulnerable and he can't be stopped. His military might is just limitless, it seems like. And so then the good guys are put in this position of, what are we going to do with this guy? How can we beat that, right? But he exists, he's just there, right? So we don't have a statement about how evil comes to be. It's just there, which actually makes perfect sense for Tolkien's overall argument, which we'll get to. at the beginning he's basically unstoppable, but he only poses basically a straightforward military threat of force. And this is very interesting in and of itself, in that I think it tells us what Tolkien thinks about the idea of a final victory over evil. Except with the exception of Dagor Dagoreth, which is briefly mentioned in the Legendarium, but not in the novel itself. Evil is seen as something that you just have to fight, that you can't get an ultimate victory over it.
Mm-hmm.
So Dagor Dagoreth is very much like Ragnarok blended with the prophecies of the New Testament, where you get a final battle between good and evil, good wins, and that's that, the end.
Mm-hmm.
But we're not there yet, and it postpones that indefinitely.
Right.
So then what does that mean? That means we're stuck here with it, and we cannot get rid of it, ever. Mm-hmm. And he does not stray from that.
Yeah.
At any point, right? He doesn't lighten that. It's very dark, but I think it's appropriate, especially given his overall argument of what we're supposed to do. Okay, so he sets that up, right? What are we supposed to do? So in my opinion, that's why I don't think that Sauron is really the main villain of the Lord of the Rings. And what I mean by main villain is the primary antagonist who opposes the protagonists at the plot level. Okay, so at the scene by scene level, he's more of an abstract force. And even though he's behind what I think is the actual main villain, he doesn't do a whole lot in himself necessarily. The actual, I think, main antagonist of the story is the One Ring itself. It's like a character, and this is a stroke of genius on Tolkien's part to do it this way, because Sauron is an abstract principle. He's like a universal.
Yep.
But the One Ring is its manifestation in physical time and space. Yep. And there are times when he does slip into personifying pure evil, where Sauron actually has conversations with Pippin and that kind of thing. But for the most part, he's in the background. He's just sort of looming like a great shadow.
Right, right.
So before I keep going, though, I want to pause.
Yeah, no.
What are your thoughts on this?
So just to clarify, for you, it's almost as if Sauron, and there's, I think, within the imagery of the eye too, and within the ring, this kind of perfect circle, this idea, right? This one thing. As you're talking, that's what you're kind of meaning by it. It's like the ring itself is the personification that is in direct interaction, right? Evil's interaction with us, not necessarily the idea is there, but it's behind it, right? That's it's pushing the ring forward. Okay. Yeah. No, I resonate with that a lot. And that makes sense kind of in terms of Tolkien's whole legendarium, in terms of what evil has been, right? This kind of dissension, this separation. So even though Sauron for is the main villain in the Lord of the Rings, he's not necessarily the main villain in its totality. So I think that makes a lot of sense.
There's another level of abstraction beyond him, which would be Melkor.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so that's one of the great things about his world building, is that there's layers upon layers, right? So, but there's an order to it. Okay, so like if you go the farthest back, you're in the most abstract and most extreme realm. Like the gods and the dragons and all of that stuff are at their most powerful. But as time goes on to the present, we go through these sort of layers of diminution, reduction, to where it's still there, but it's just not as extreme or as powerful. And in the Third Age, we've got Sauron, and he's the latest sort of emanation of the evil. Now, a great question for Tolkien experts out there is, do you think that evil needs to exist in Tolkien's world? Because it's not really answered. It just sort of happens. And Iluvatar is basically like God, just given a cool elvish name. And so the question is, did he know about this? Did he set it up for this to happen? These are classic questions, right, for monotheistic religion. So that is where you're seeing the blend, the blurry boundary between Tolkien's fantasy story and actual theology. Because this was very much deliberate, I think, on his part to do this. He was a devout Catholic. He was very well versed, and I'm sure he read Aquinas and Aristotle and all this stuff, Plato, etc. But getting back to the Lord of the Rings, anyway. Whereas Sauron is the abstract manifestation of pure evil, the One Ring is the thing that's actually doing most of the heavy lifting and the work in terms of interacting with the individual characters on a day-to-day basis. Frodo's constantly got this thing hanging on him, and it's in his head, and it gets worse and worse and worse as he goes. And then the other characters, of course, are always kind of reacting to that. They're always trying to help Frodo, or then they split up and go off on different side quests and everything. But it's all about, ultimately, Frodo is still the center of the story, and his battle with the One Ring. Boromir struggles with it. Saruman wants it. Everybody wants it, right? Gandalf is tempted. Galadriel is tempted. That's the whole point of the One Ring. It does that. The One Ring it acts also. It's described literally as a character sometimes. Like, it wants to be found, right? That's what Gandalf tells Frodo. And it does things to try to get itself found, to the extent that it can. So it's constantly a threat. It's nearly impossible to fight indefinitely. In fact, I think the argument is that ultimately it will take you. It'll dominate your mind, and there's no escape. It's kind of dark.
Right? It's really dark. There's just so much in that. There's so much in there. It's a really good point, because if you have I'm looking at it this way, and I look at characters like Saruman, for instance, but Galadriel and everything like that, but like a healthy relationship with power, more so a healthy relationship with yourself in the greater world around you. And you had somebody like Saruman, who was very much a jealous Maiar, jealous wizard. And I love his speech to Gandalf, his kind of like unfolding of his great plot.
And it's all very reasonable sounding.
Yeah, exactly. But it's all based off of this complex and this idea. It's like, okay, we can control, we can be the ones to be at the top.
And that's how the ring does its thing. It gets into your head and says, you can be the Sauron, or you can be Sauron. You can be the Dark One, master of everything.
Right.
Oh yeah, me. Well, I'm a good guy, so I would use this power for good. But then of course, pretty soon you're not anymore. And it's like, it steals away your judgment. That's terrifying.
Right.
Absolutely terrifying. And we know that, and that's why it's so complex and so realistic. And you would think realistic. This is Lord of the Rings. It's fantasy. But psychologically, as we've mentioned, fantasy has the ability to be the most psychologically realistic of all genres.
Right.
And this is how it's done. This is how you do this, people. Internet, right? This is how you do it. If you have something to say, right? It's a problem. Is a lot of times I don't think they have a whole lot really interesting to add to this conversation, but Tolkien really did. And not only was that because of his own pretty harsh, things happening to him in life. He lost a lot of folks in his family. Many of people around him died. I think his parents died when he was very young. All that stuff. But and then of course World War I, right? All of that, right? He saw miles of endless carnage and God only knows what, and that got under his skin. But his way of expressing it was sublime, and this is the way he did it, right? The story, it's all him. I mean, the publisher, this is definitely a sign of the times, say, hey, could you write a sequel to The Hobbit? It was a great story. He says, sure. 13 years later, he comes up with this monstrous tome.
1,000
like,
pages. Yeah. Yeah.
okay, I guess we'll publish that. Like, no way he could get away with that now, but that was a different time. Anyway, so the One Ring gets into your head, and Sauron then at this point tells us what the end point is, right? It'll turn you into the next Sauron.
Mm.
And so the way that he kind of mystifies this by blurring the boundaries between the One Ring and Sauron himself, means that even saying that the One Ring is more the primary antagonist than Sauron isn't quite exactly right, because the One Ring kind of is Sauron in your hand. So it's very interesting how he takes that idea that a symbol can have a manifestation in physical reality, like an idea like this, and he just leans so hard into that with the way he depicts this by continually blurring the boundaries between the physical and the ideal.
Right.
This is one of the reasons why it was so tough, I think, to film this novel as a whole. And Peter Jackson did a fantastic job, but there was a couple of things that he had to do, like show Sauron as a literal floating eyeball, that just kind of don't capture what the book is going for. And it's because film is a very concrete medium. It's there on the screen or it ain't. So you can't get away with the kind of stuff you can in a novel where you're mainly kind of in your head. And so you can blur boundaries like that a whole lot more easily.
Yeah.
But if you let it, though, the One Ring will turn you into Sauron, and it'll basically lead you to that end, which is dim-witted, cruel army of orcs, bootlicking, right? All that stuff.
It leads to this kind of this everything being one and the same.
Yeah.
Right. And I was going to ask you, what are your, in this vein, because I think that Tolkien's, I think he had a quote. It was that evil toils in vain, because it will always just lead to good pretty much sprouting from the ground, right? In that soil. And I think there is something to be said in terms of what you're mentioning, is that, there is never going to be this defeating of what we consider to be evil, right? It's almost like these peaks and valleys. And I think through Gandalf also, he has a quote in terms of just, all we can do is, decide what to do with the time that is given to us in our time. And then we can't really be concerned with the ruin of future generations, but we can at the very least provide them with the land, provide them with somewhere to grow, right?
Yeah.
So I wanted to know for you how you connect the evil of the ring, this corrupting force, right? Because I think with Frodo, it's a prime example. He's this exemplar of innocence, but by the end of it, like you said, eventually it will corrupt. It's like being bombarded with that idea constantly. Like your entire life is just saturated with that oneness.
Yeah.
How does it relate to nature for you?
Oh, nature. I'm not quite sure I understand the question.
So the way I'm thinking, because for Tolkien, it was that nature was so much the good, right? Like the natural process of things. You look at Saruman, and he was this kind of mind of metal, these gears, all that, and it was really this, I suppose, a means for control.
Well, I think that's right. I see what you're saying now. So, Tolkien introduced this whole idea of technology versus nature into his story. And I don't think he was the first person to do this, but he was the one who baked it into his story whole cloth. I mean, it's all throughout the whole thing. And it's a popular theme even now. It's definitely a part of Star Wars too.
Yep.
It's part of all kinds of stories. And so I think for Tolkien, nature represented the goodness of creation versus just this desire to dominate and clear out everything in your path. Kind of relentless, making things in an artificial way. And so it was the will kind of running amok.
Yeah.
And not engaging with what is in front of you and working with it. Rather, it's let's just chop it all down and burn it to the ground. And so that's why he saw this, of course, in his homeland. When he came back from World War One, he was very disappointed. And that's what the whole Scouring of the Shire piece of the story is about. Because hobbits are us. We're hobbits. And I mean, that meaning by that, the regular everyday person. So then the One Ring then represents the desire to just, well, I mean, and Galadriel says it in the movie, right? The will to dominate all life is what it is. And in a way that's kind of a very lonely and miserable existence, but it's definitely in there, right?
Right.
And it's just a part of, now you could argue it's a part of nature itself. I think it probably is, but so the question is to not let it run amok and get out of control and dominate everything. But the way that he depicts that is that it is not only that, but it is also incredibly difficult to resist getting pulled in that direction.
Right.
And seeing the way the world changed over his lifetime, I can understand why he felt that way. Because every single, country that he was, aware of seemed to be heading in this very same direction. And, even today, we're kind of still seeing a lot of that. So he symbolized that as the One Ring, which you can't destroy it. You can't just toss it away, right? He goes through all the arguments of why you can't do any of those, which means you got to carry it, right? It's the only thing you can do is just carry it around, but you can't use it, right? Because that'll make you evil too. Or if you do, you got to limit it, And so the only way to avoid then pure evil, i.e. Sauron, from destroying everything is to take that One Ring to its source, the volcano, and destroy it. Now it's interesting. Why do you think it's a volcano? Why was it built there? What's the deal? I mean, why not a cold, why not a bucket of water?
It's like the fire of fires, right? That's the earth fire. It's the earth blood in a sense. It's back from, it's a womb. Honestly, the ring's kind of birthing place. It's where it came from. Bringing it back to its source and where it was given life in a sense.
So a cave would be a suitable representation of a womb.
Yeah.
But in this instance, it's a cave that's full of lava, right? So there's the fire aspect to it, which I think imports the idea of intense affect and passion, both for good or bad. So it's kind of making this argument that in of itself is not necessarily bad, passion and intense affect. But when it is artificially concentrated into this thing, that's when it becomes extremely dangerous. And the only way to destroy it is to bring it back to where it came from.
Yeah.
You can't analyze it away. You can't pretend it away. You can't think it away. You have to engage with it at the affect level. So it's another metaphor for depth psychology work. You got to go down to the source, the primordial fire of the reptile brain.
Right.
All that kind of jazz. So I think it's very apt. I don't know if it was intentional. I kind of doubt it was. But it just felt right, and that's why he did that. It's in the fires of Mount Doom.
So would you also say then that Sauron is not, if we were, I mean, clearly it's this Maiar, but Sauron and by extension Melkor, right? These representations of evil, these absolutes, aren't dealing with, in a sense, that affect, that passion coming forward in a healthy way. They are kind of isolating it. Right. They're isolating artificially into this thing. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. They're funneling all that. I mean, you see this in, fascists and neo-Nazis and stuff like that. They are incredibly passionate about what they're doing. It's all affect driven, and it gives a lot of power to what they're doing. Because I mean, if you don't have the affect there, you're just not going to have as much oomph.
Yeah.
But this isn't about rational thought. This is about rage and anger and paranoia and lashing out and all that stuff. So the One Ring represents an ability to take that and focus it to such an intense degree. I mean, this is another good question for Tolkien experts out there. What the hell does the ring actually do? Right? It goes on and on about how it's so good, so well described, and the way it affects you, and it's all that. But like its actual powers are kind of vague. Okay, they're really vague. Right? It turns you invisible. Okay, what does that have to do with anything? And there's a connection there, but I mean, for the most part, you can use it to dominate and focus. Okay, what does that mean? That means taking the will and organizing everything around the will, right? The ego, the idea of I want X. The ring gives you the ability to do that. The reason why they couldn't destroy Barad-dûr was because it was made with the power of the ring, whatever that means. But of course, Tolkien can get away with that stuff. Like, made with the power of the ring. I got you. Because he describes the ring so vividly in these abstract and symbolic way, but it's still very powerful and resonant. So he can say that and everybody knows what he means. Pretty impressive. Okay. So then that gets us to all the ways that the characters interact with the One Ring. So everyone feels the push-pull of it. All right, they know that it's bad, but they still want to have it on some level. And I love the way that Peter Jackson put in the scene where Aragorn has that brief scene with Frodo. That was perfect. And I'm like, why wasn't that in the book? Someday in the afterlife, right? I'm going to go find Tolkien and say, how come you didn't put that in there, man?
He's smoking a pipe like, trust me, I know. I should have. I get it.
Yeah. Or he's gonna say, I'm Tolkien. Who are you?
Yeah. Right.
Who are you to tell me what to do? I'm like, okay, that's fair. But So the other neat thing about it is that the more powerful you are, the more powerful the effect of it is. So the more tempting it is. If you're already powerful, like Aragorn or Gandalf or Galadriel, the temptation is even more powerful. Well, that makes sense, but then the inverse does too. So lowly characters like hobbits are more resistant to it because of that. Isn't that interesting? So all of this stuff is connecting power dynamics with evil in a very concrete sort of way. Yeah. And he makes all of these very specific connections. And maybe it's just because if you're Aragorn, right, you're already super badass. The One Ring would just, amplify it tenfold. Right. So, think of the great things I could do with this power, right? But, he knows better. But it's someone who knows better. He knows enough not to even entertain the thought because that could lead him down the path. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. So now what about Gollum though?
Yeah.
How does he fit into all this, do you think?
I love the way Tolkien describes him in the books. He's almost like this insect husk of what he once was. And it's so vivid. The encounter in Lothlorien where Frodo's looking down from kind of where he's supposed to be sleeping, and in the shadows he just sees these two eyes almost crawling up towards him, right? And Gollum for me was he's an absolute tragedy, right? Mm-hmm. The kind of over-identification of a complex to the extent that it becomes so maladaptive that it just sucks the energy out of you. You become identified with it to the extent where it is this obsession. I have to live through this because this is me. It is my precious, right? Yeah.
He becomes obsessed with it. Yeah. Completely dominates every thought.
Yeah, it's everything.
Every minute of every day.
Yeah.
So Tolkien gives us a couple of, I mentioned earlier how the ring turns you into a Sauron, but that's only for the super powerful characters in the story.
Right.
Like Gandalf would become, and Galadriel would, if they'd taken the ring, become just a replacement Sauron, but functionally the same thing. That's why they don't want it. But then he also gives us other examples of other beings at lower levels of, in his hierarchy of being. So characters like the great kings that took the 9 rings.
Oh yeah.
They don't become Saurons, they become ring wraiths. So I think Gollum represents what happens to hobbits when they get a hold of the ring. It turns them into golems. These poor, like you say, little husks, barely alive, barely able to think for themselves. But there's still a spark of humanity in there, or hobbitry, whatever the word is, hobbitanity. And that he's not wholly evil. And because the ring doesn't necessarily do that, I guess, to hobbits per se. But then that kind of reflects on us in the so-called real world, in the sense that hobbits are representations of us, and the humans in the story are more represents of great heroes of the past. And that's what humans are in the Lord of the Rings. And then elves are one level above that, and then the Maiar are above that level in Valar. So, yeah. So Gollum is now. What do you think of the meaning behind the fact that Gollum is actually the one who destroys the ring with himself?
I think it's symbolic of really that it's inevitable that if you kind of are so ensnared by this oneness, this perfection, this idea, right, or even the idea of perfection, the idea of power, all of these, it's kind of the culmination of what could potentially happen to you if you give into it to the extent that you do, right? And yeah, I think it's really a journey towards death for him.
Well, so for me, it's a part of Tolkien's argument about what evil is and how it can be dealt with and how it cannot be dealt with. He makes a very consistent point that nobody can resist the ring, period. And with one exception, that would be Tom Bombadil. But whatever the hell Tom Bombadil is, he's kind of outside that's a whole other conversation. Yeah. But I mean, clearly he is not at the same level of what's going on in the story. So it's as if Tolkien is saying there are things outside of this endless war between good and evil that are just utterly beyond it. And that's why it's such a great piece that he includes in the story. And so many people are like, why are we doing this bit about Tom Bombadil? It makes sense from this point of view for me, that he needed to show us that even with all of this carrying on about good and evil, it's just our level, right? There's so much stuff going on beyond that. But then it's like, and now we bring you back to your regularly scheduled conflict with evil and you move on. So outside of Bombadil, nobody can resist the ring. Sauron can't resist it himself, even though he made it, which that's also interesting. But I remember there's a part, I forget where exactly, but I think Gandalf mentions that even Sauron himself is overwhelmed with lust for the ring, which is very cool. And how if the ring symbolizes that will to dominate and that desire for possession, right? That's another piece of this puzzle too. If in depicting evil as a object and a ring at that, which binds, right? Binds people together. But also it latches on, right? It's about toxic attachment. I can't let go of anything, right? So the Buddhists talk about letting go as being extremely powerful tool to achieve, a calm state of mind. And the One Ring is like the exact opposite of it. It's a thing that you can't let go of.
Right.
You can't let go of it. And so it would have been very easy for him to say, look how heroic Frodo is. He fought, he threw away the ring. Yay, good guys win. It would have been so easy to do that. And it still would have been a great story. But he doesn't. He doesn't. He stays with his idea of what evil is. It is impossible to fight it. It just amazes me that sneaks past people. And they say it's such a goody-goody story and it's all happy and hearts and flowers. I'm like, you're not paying attention to the story, man. He's saying you can't fight evil. I mean, you can't defeat it. You can only fight it.
Yeah.
And like, if you can't defeat it, then what's the point of fighting it? Well, that's also in there too.
That's the point.
That is the point. Exactly. That is the end goal. It's the thing. So I mean, that's just really resonant to me. Now, the fact that nobody can willingly destroy the ring is why Sauron doesn't bother to stick 7,000 orcs around Mount Doom in, full gear, because that would have made it impossible to beat him completely. But he, being overwhelmed with lust for the ring himself, figured nobody could possibly do that. They would take it and use it, in which case he would still win, ultimately. I mean, well, not necessarily. I mean, evil would triumph, but he wouldn't necessarily win. He could be overthrown by Gandalf with the One Ring, for example, or Galadriel. I think it even says that Galadriel was one of the few beings that Sauron actually feared.
Mm.
So, yeah. So now the way that that Tolkien doesn't just tell us that nobody can resist the ring. He shows us, okay, and he shows us through Frodo. Frodo is the most potent of all the characters in Middle Earth. He's the one guy who is most likely to be able to resist the ring because, number one, he's a hobbit, and number two, he himself actually has a very powerful will about him. He's highly intelligent. He's also got strong leadership qualities. You don't see this as much in the movies, but it's definitely in there in the books.
Yep.
So he's got the perfect combination of being able to resist the ring, and he fails. What do you think that means? Just what we've been saying, right?
I mean, it's almost like a path towards individuation in a way, in a dark way, to kind of like, I don't know, maybe I'm making a connection where there isn't a connection.
I don't know. It's worth exploring.
But I look at it this way, like, I mean, if you're always going to be confronted with things that you have to kind of continually improve on, or at the very least, not even confront, but face up to, like, understand better your ability to latch on to certain ideas or complexes or associations that might not necessarily be the best for you. Instead of over identifying with those, you kind of go through your depth work, and that's it's almost like a life's work, that you're kind of sifting through. And I think that, for Gollum was that over identification. Gollum was that kind of embodiment of like, this is me, this is all I need, I'll always be okay, right? For Frodo at that very end, pretty much saying, it's pretty much showing you that no, you're not always going to be able to do it. But I think the key thing here is you can't do it alone, right? Mm-hmm. There has to be relationships, and that's why Sam is by far, in that moment for me, Sam represented that kind of need to have people around you, even when you're at the weakest. You have to have people around you. Yeah.
So again, Tolkien doesn't just tell us that the key to defeating evil is to not think of yourself as, the only actor in the universe, right? That leads to isolation, which amplifies the desire to dominate others. Yep. It's the power drive, right? Which works in opposition. Like Jung said, that where power exists, love cannot, and they're opposites of each other. If you are in a loving relationship with others, then you don't want to dominate them. So, and again, but he shows us this by having 2 hobbits and 1 Gollum. Gollum doesn't have any friends. He doesn't need anything because he's got the precious. He's in his own head with we, us, all that stuff, right? Got that split. He's literally got a split personality.
Yeah. What does Sam call him?
The movie depicts that.
Sam calls him like Stinker, and then
Stinker
another
and Slinker.
Slinker, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting how I love it in the books so much more than, not so much more than in the film, but in the books, it really kind of, you get a real sense that there's something really not okay.
Oh yeah. And Andy Serkis, I think, just brilliantly displays that with his depiction of Gollum. So then, at the end here, at this last moment, evil essentially defeats itself. It undoes itself. Mm-hmm. That we can't defeat it, but it will defeat itself if we hang on long enough. So that's another nuance to this argument, this long, complex highly nuanced argument about what evil is and what are we supposed to do about it. It's not, just go beat it up and then because I'm stronger and yay, I win. No, it's not that easy at all. I'm sure Tolkien had seen enough in his life to help him to realize that that's just not that easy.
Right.
The ego would wish that to be the case, but no. So the One Ring then I think is kind of like the ultimate villain here because it can't be resisted. The longer you're with it, the worse you get, and you can't stop the process. That's a very scary thing.
Yeah.
And the way to deal with that kind of foe, not only does he give us this foe, but then he says, actually, you can still win against that. And it's not just fight and defeat Sauron, right? Just go beat him up with big armies. Nope, can't do that. His army's too big, too strong. You can't just use the ring because then you either become Sauron, you become a ring wraith, or you become a Gollum. You can't even just destroy it. I mean, even Elrond thought, go destroy it, right? He didn't account for just how powerful the One Ring really is, and that nobody could resist. Nobody could get that far and actually throw it in. If Frodo couldn't do it, nobody could do it. The more powerful characters could get there more easily, maybe, because they could just slice their way through. But then once they got to the center of the power where it's at its height, they would have said, the ring is mine, just like Frodo does. And it's not just destroy Sauron's forces, right? It's not, no. The solution is to resist it to the utmost, even though you can't beat it. You fight it anyway. There's a great line in the book. I wish it had been in the movie. After Gandalf fell in Moria, they're like in a huddle trying to figure out, okay, now what do we do? And one of the characters, and maybe one of the hobbits, said, well, how are we supposed to go on now? Without Gandalf, there's no hope. And Aragorn says, well, then we're going to have to go on without hope. And I mean, that's like a classic Aragorn moment, right?
Right.
But that's Tolkien showing us what the answer is. It's not an in-depth character study of Aragorn, right? So if we're looking for that, we're going to be disappointed. They tried to introduce that kind of stuff in the movie, give him a character arc and a flaw and all that kind of stuff, and it works okay. But I don't think it was necessary. I don't really think it was necessary because the argument and the complexity is in the symbols and the interactions of the characters, not so much the characters themselves. They're more like pieces on the chessboard. You got to look at the whole board to get the message. If you're looking at individual pieces, you're not going to see a huge amount of complexity there, except with Gollum. Gollum's super complex. So I guess at the end of the day here, the moral complexity that people like to see because it's real, it feels authentic. If you look at Lord of the Rings like you would a drama where the characters are complex internally, you're going to be disappointed, I think. The moral complexity, it doesn't come from like amoral edgelord characters, right? It doesn't come from that. That wouldn't do justice, I think, to what Tolkien was trying to do. It would take away from it, I think, if Aragorn was kind of edgy and sometimes lashed out and did questionable, sketchy stuff. It just wouldn't work. It wouldn't work. Same with Gandalf, although Gandalf does some sketchy stuff sometimes, but it's okay. Instead, he's making a statement about evil as objectively existing force that is in the universe and we can't eliminate it. Okay. If you are going to put all of the moral complexity in the heads of your characters, you can't say something like that. You can't do what Tolkien did. In a way, it actually makes the world a little bit more comforting because evil only just comes from people. It's not an independent existing power that you have to contend with that's outside of you. Right? That, I don't know about you, but that seems a hell of a lot more terrifying.
Yeah.
And I can see that evil can certainly come from within people. And so they're kind of both true.
Yeah. It can be infectious, right?
Yeah.
That kind of that individual, but then that collective complex around it. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a trend now to where people are putting more morally complex characters in their fantasy stories. And in a way, I think they're kind of working against each other when they're working against themselves when they do this. Like George Martin, and nothing against him. I'm sure I haven't read, I couldn't get through Game of Thrones myself, but I know it's very popular and he's a fantastic writer. But this was, at the time I didn't realize this, but this was part of the problem I had, is I could tell very early on that he was telling stories about characters that were much more like the people of the real world, and that the evil was coming from within them. There was no external force of evil. There was the ice zombies or whatever, I guess, but yeah. It's kind of an afterthought, really, compared to all the machinations that's going on that happened in the story. And that is very much based on reality. He based that story on the War of the Roses and all of the backstabbing and carrying on that went on during that time period in history. Well, that's realistic, but the more realism you get, the less fantasy you get. So it's a trade-off.
Yeah.
Trade-off.
Well, Martin, I don't even know if they're real people. They're just a lot of people in positions of power that have these really terrible power complexes. You know, like it's that. I think that's my biggest issue with Game of Thrones, is that eventually I got to a point where I'm like, I don't know if I like any of these characters.
Yeah.
And I think it's because there's so much that is unresolved within them that I just can't.
Right. And you're like, what is the point of this?
Yeah, exactly.
I'm not learning anything by this story.
Yeah.
It's just telling me that people suck.
People suck.
People suck. Yeah. You know, and people with power suck even more.
Yeah, exactly. I'm just like, I don't need to read that. That's not fantasy for me. It's not getting to a core truth. It just means it's a little bit more superficial, in my opinion.
Well,
in terms of really, yeah.
And it's an interesting paradox, isn't it? Because he was depicting people as they are likely to behave in that situation. You know, maybe he amplified it a little bit for narrative tension, but for the most part, we definitely see examples of this in history, of people misbehaving when they have lots of power. So power corrupts is kind of the theme. Well, hell, Tolkien said that too in his story. Mm-hmm. And that was a central theme: power corrupts. Now, there's a whole lot more to it than that. Not just if you have power, you're going to be corrupt, and that's that. There's way more complexity to it. We've just listed it all.
Yeah, yeah.
So he said the same thing, but he used different, you know, the narrative form of the fantasy to tell that story. And it's, you know, obviously it worked. I mean, Lord of the Rings is one of the best-selling books of all time. So, but I think it's because if you situate all evil within the human psyche, then it almost kind of deflates it, and it's easy to take it less seriously than if we're going to take it seriously as an external force. You know, and sometimes I work with folks that have very strong beliefs in the devil, for example.
Yep.
And I'm not going to sit here and argue with them about that, right? And get into a metaphysical debate about that.
Oh, of course.
I know what they're talking about, right? Forces of destruction, chaos, and bad behavior, and right? If you externalize it like that, well, I'm more interested in what do you plan to do about this, right? If it's just I'm going to blame the devil for everything, which is the criticism that gets, okay, that's not cool. But usually it's not that. Usually they're more willing to go further into this idea of there are things I need to do to try to keep the devil from getting into my head. Okay, so I work with them rather than fight with them. I work with that. Besides, he could be out there. Who knows?
Yeah. I think that's a great. That's the working with what presents. I think that's an amazing way to kind of go about it, instead of saying, "Oh no, that's not real."
Yeah,
like,
right.
Well, it's real for me, you know. Like, yeah, exactly. I think that's
yeah. Now, if you don't situate evil as a true other, though, what that does, I think, is it means that evil can be contained, it can be explained away, it can be safely put into a nice, neat box. I'll just call it a complex or whatever. And that gets us away from horror, fantasy, and sci-fi genre stuff, because those genres have the ability to, whether they use it or not, but they have within the toolbox of storytelling techniques to say that evil is an other that is out there and it can destroy you and consume you. And what are you going to do about it? Right. And of course, that's what Lord of the Rings does so well.
I think the person. So for me, when I'm thinking about this, I think it's the other doesn't hold any power unless it's personally engaged with, really. So the ring really doesn't have any power unless somebody's actually holding it.
That's an interesting point. Yeah.
So it's like, well, all right, yeah, evil can be out there, but is it really evil unless I'm kind of allow, like, just like you said, I'm allowing the devil into my life, right?
Right.
And as as we're talking about this, and something that's always been kind of resonant with me is like, yes, it's always going to be there. There's always going to be the kind of personal engagement with what we might consider as, might not even at the time consider as negative ideas or negative ruminations or whatever it is, because hell, I mean, if Boromir held that ring, what was it? It was the road to hell was paved with good intentions.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
He wanted to save his people, but he had he was like, I need to do this. Like but it was mixed in with his own glory. Whereas Faramir could give two shits. He was like, you know what? I don't want to do any of this.
Yeah.
So it's those that grasp it, right? Which I think we all have to contend with. We all have to contend with these parts of ourselves that, or these things that might not necessarily be in our best interest. But I think at the end, it's like, that's social interest, that's social engagement, the other, right? The true other, the nature. That's what's really going to pull you away from it. I think of the likes of like Schopenhauer or Nietzsche or, anybody that's kind of like separate yourself from the relationship with the world. And I think that might be what the ring does. Like when you put it on, you're invisible. You are not in the world.
Right. Yeah.
You're in its world.
Yeah.
And there's something there.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can't be seen anymore. So you, like you say, you can sneak around and disengage yourself from it. It's almost like dissociation.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Really vivid picture of how that kind of works. Like I'm checked out. You can't see me, and I'm just not here.
Yeah.
But of course the ring wraiths are there, and they're after you. They
Right.
can see you.
Right.
All right. So that's a whole nother level of terror.
Yeah, I was about to say, oh man, here we go. The demons are coming. Oh man.
Yeah, that's
so
right.
So to speak.
Yeah, and I think that's the reason for that imagery. I mean, it started off probably as a retcon because the One Ring, or the ring that Bilbo found, was not originally the One Ring. That he developed that idea and kind of retconned it into the Lord of the Rings and said, well, actually, that was the One Ring, and here's how it got into Frodo's hands. So it works. It really works really well.
Yeah.
So not all retcons are bad.
No.
I'd say probably a lot of fantasy, or not just fantasy, but any storytelling involves a lot of that. But so there's evil.
Yeah.
Do with it what you will. Beware of it.
Beware of it.
Yeah.
He who holds the ring, be very wary of its power.
Well, like you were saying, the road to hell being paved with good intentions. Tolkien thought of that too, which is why he gave us the Saruman arc there.
Yeah.
He wanted to learn more about the rings. The more he learned about them, the more he wanted to learn more about them. And so he became sucked in that way, as brilliant, as powerful as he was. And he came up with this, basically, a fantasy, an ego fantasy of, well, I can be the wielder of the One Ring and defeat Sauron. And we'll pretend like we're on his side for a while, and then we'll overthrow him later. There's no real difference in what we're trying to do here. I mean, it's just total BS. Right? He's BSing himself more than anybody else, but that's what happens.
Yeah.
And I see this clinically, and done to myself in the past, of outsmarting yourself, basically. And that's kind of what he did. He outsmarted himself.
Yeah.
He was so smart. He conjured up an explanation that made sense to him, but really it just served his desire for glory and for the One Ring.
Right.
It came in right underneath the wire there.
Those you bring up such a good point in terms of just sitting in these thoughts. And I mean, he's just this disconnected man, wizard, in his great Tower of Orthanc, just sitting there saying, you know, I could do this, I can do that. And I mean, like, even his corruption of the earth to the extent that it was, man, I mean, I feel like we could talk about this for like 5 hours, because there's just so much in terms of like what actually is the ring and what it represents in terms of those levels of kind of corruption and evil.
Well, the symbolism in Lord of the Rings is extremely complex and very powerful. It's condensed. It's very dense symbolism is what I'm trying to say. For example, I mean, you bring up Saruman in the Tower. We've got a really interesting triad of wizards that Tolkien gives us.
Mm-hmm.
You've got Radagast, who spends too much time in wandering around nature and doesn't really accomplish a whole lot.
Mm-hmm.
We've got Saruman, who completely separates himself from nature and becomes part of the problem. And so neither one of these guys, so Radagast is not part of the solution. Saruman becomes part of the problem. Gandalf is in the middle.
Yeah.
He wanders the world far and wide, but he doesn't get lost in the woods like Radagast does. So he's still in nature, unlike Saruman.
Yeah. Right.
So you can see there's that beautiful symmetry there with the wizards.
Yeah.
And
There's
just talking to you, I realized that just this second.
Yeah. Right.
Oh, wow, that's there too. I never noticed that.
What you just explained, I never thought of before. So thank you.
No, there we go.
It's so true. It's
there it is.
Yeah, there it is. Boom.
All right. I guess we'll end with that. And hopefully you guys out there, all three of my fans out there, will want to watch our next video.
Hopefully I'll be sharing this with all one of my fans, which
there you
is
go.
myself. Right now.
Yes.
But no, good stuff.
Anyone watching this, make sure you check out Nick's channel. Good stuff.
Maybe.
Yeah, maybe.
No, but as always, Dr. Goodwin, I appreciate you having me on, and I look forward to next time.
All right. We'll see you.
All right. Thank you, sir.
We'll see you.
Bye.